transformation rarely arrives as a sudden breakthrough. More often it unfolds quietly through small, consistent actions that reshape a person from the inside out. This truth is beautifully illustrated in the story of Zengai, a man who once carried the heavy burden of guilt from his past. Rather than running from his mistakes or trying to erase them, he chose a different path, one of redemption through service. High in the mountains where travelers struggled to pass safely, Zengai began an almost impossible task, digging a tunnel through solid rock. It was not a project of days or months, but of decades. With each strike of his chisel, he was not only carving a path through stone, but also reshaping his own character. At first glance, the task seemed overwhelming. The mountain was vast, and his tools were simple. Yet, Zengai did not measure progress by distance completed, but by effort given. Day after day, year after year, he continued his work in silence, without recognition or praise. What sustained him was not the promise of reward, but the quiet understanding that every small action mattered. As the Buddha taught, drop by drop is the water pot filled. In the same way, each small act of effort, each moment of perseverance, accumulated into something far greater than any single action could achieve. What makes Zengai's story so powerful is not just the tunnel he created, but the transformation it represents. The man who began as someone seeking to atone for his past slowly became someone worthy of deep respect, not because his past disappeared, but because he allowed it to become the fuel for meaningful action. His guilt did not destroy him, it guided him. His mistakes did not define him, his response to them did. This challenges a common belief that failure marks the end of possibility. In truth, failure can be the very beginning of a deeper, more purposeful life. When we stop seeing our past as something to hide and start seeing it as something to transform, we open the door to growth. The smallest actions, helping someone staying committed, choosing integrity in a difficult moment, may seem insignificant on their own. But over time, they accumulate, shaping not only the world around us, but the person we become. Zengai's tunnel stands as a symbol of this quiet power. Built one strike at a time, it reminds us that lasting change does not come from grand gestures, but from steady dedication. In the same way, our lives are shaped not by a single decision, but by the countless small choices we make each day. And within those choices lies the possibility of redemption, not as a distant ideal, but as something we build patiently and persistently moment by moment. Human beings have a natural tendency to judge quickly, often forming conclusions about others based on limited information. This instinct, while efficient, can also be deeply misleading. The story of Geshen, known as the stingy artist, reveals just how easily appearances can distort our understanding of reality. Geshen was a talented monk whose paintings were admired for their beauty and spiritual depth. Yet unlike other monks who created art freely or as acts of devotion, Geshen demanded payment in advance, and not just any payment, but high fees that many considered excessive. Because of this, people began to whisper about him. They saw greed where there might have been purpose, corruption where there might have been discipline. His reputation as a stingy artist spread, shaping how others perceived him long before they truly understood him. Society often relies on surface-level observations to make judgments. When behavior deviates from what is expected, especially in a religious or moral context, it is quickly labeled as wrong. In Geshen's case, his actions contradicted the ideal image of a detached monk. Monks were supposed to reject material wealth, to live simply, to give freely. By charging money, Geshen seemed to violate these principles, and so people assumed the worst. This reveals a deeper psychological pattern. We tend to interpret unfamiliar or uncomfortable behavior through the lens of our own expectations. When something doesn't fit our mental model, we often resolve the discomfort by assigning negative meaning to it. Quick judgment gives us a sense of certainty, but it often comes at the cost of truth. Instead of asking questions or seeking deeper understanding, we settle for convenient explanations. It is easier to label someone as greedy than to consider that their actions might serve a purpose we cannot yet see. In this way, judgment becomes less about the person we are observing and more about the limitations of our own perspective. We see what we are prepared to see, not necessarily what is actually there. The danger of this mindset is not only that it leads to misunderstanding, but that it can blind us to hidden value. By reducing Geshen to a stereotype, Those around him failed to look beyond his behavior and discover his true intentions. They mistook discipline for greed, focus for selfishness, and purpose for material attachment. This kind of misjudgment happens constantly in everyday life. We assume someone is arrogant when they are simply reserved, selfish when they are struggling, or indifferent when they are overwhelmed. Each assumption creates distance, reinforcing separation instead of understanding. Gessen's story invites us to pause before forming conclusions. It reminds us that what we see is only a fragment of a much larger reality. Beneath every action lies a story, a motivation, a context that we may not immediately perceive. When we rush to judge, we close ourselves off from that deeper truth. But when we remain curious, when we question our first impressions, we create space for insight and compassion. In doing so, we begin to move beyond appearances and toward a more complete understanding of the people around us. What appeared to be greed in Gessen's behavior was, in truth, a quiet and extraordinary form of compassion, one that remained hidden beneath the surface for many years. While people criticized him for demanding high payments for his artwork, few ever stopped to ask why. They saw only the outer layer of his actions, not the deeper intention guiding them. In reality, Gessen was not accumulating wealth for personal comfort or status. He was working toward three profound and selfless goals that required both time and resources to fulfill. The first of these was to help those suffering during times of famine. In his province, food shortages were a recurring crisis, leaving countless families struggling to survive. Rather than offering temporary aid, Gessen quietly created a hidden reserve of food, stockpiling rice and essentials, so that when hardship struck, he could provide relief to those in need. His so-called greed was in fact feeding the hungry. The second goal was to improve a dangerous and poorly maintained road that connected his village to a national shrine. This road was not merely a path. It was a lifeline for travelers, pilgrims, and ordinary people seeking connection and meaning. Yet it caused injuries and hardship due to its condition. Gessen envisioned something better, a road that would serve generations to come, making journeys safer and more accessible. Every coin he collected through his art brought that vision closer to reality. The third and most personal goal was to honor his teacher. Before passing away, his teacher had dreamed of building a temple, a place where others could practice, learn, and awaken. That dream had remained unfinished. Gessen took it upon himself to complete it, not for recognition, but out of deep gratitude and devotion. In this way, his actions were not only practical but spiritual, an expression of loyalty, respect, and continuity. When viewed from the outside, Gessen's behavior seemed to contradict everything a monk should represent. But when understood from within, it revealed a profound alignment with compassion and purpose. This contrast highlights a fundamental truth: appearance and intention are often not the same. What looks selfish may be selfless. What seems inappropriate may be deeply meaningful. Without understanding intention, our judgments remain incomplete. This story challenges us to reconsider how we interpret the actions of others. We often rely on visible behavior as evidence of character, assuming that what we see reflects the whole truth. But in doing so, we ignore the invisible forces, motivation, context, long-term vision that truly shape human action. Gessen was not concerned with how he was perceived because his focus was not on reputation but on results. He was willing to be misunderstood if it meant fulfilling his purpose. In our own lives, we may encounter people whose actions confuse or even frustrate us. Instead of rushing to label or criticize, we might ask what intention could lie beneath this behavior. What purpose might we not yet see? By shifting our attention from appearance to intention, we open ourselves to a deeper level of understanding, one that allows compassion to replace judgment. Gessen's life reminds us that true goodness does not always look the way we expect it to, and that sometimes the most generous hearts are hidden behind the most misunderstood actions. One of the most subtle yet powerful sources of misunderstanding in human life is what Zen teachings often point to as the surface mind. This is the layer of consciousness that reacts quickly, labels instantly, and forms conclusions without depth. It is the part of the mind that seeks certainty even when it has only fragments of information to work with. Rather than remaining open and observant, the surface mind rushes to construct stories, filling in gaps with assumptions, beliefs, and past experiences. In doing so, it creates a version of reality that feels convincing, but is often incomplete or entirely inaccurate. Human beings are natural storytellers. When we encounter a situation we do not fully understand, the mind instinctively tries to make sense of it. A single action, a brief expression, or a few words can become the foundation for an entire narrative. For example, if someone speaks in a cold tone, we may quickly conclude that they are unfriendly or disrespectful. If a colleague avoids eye contact, we might assume they are hiding something or dislike us. In truth, we are not responding to what is actually happening. We are responding to the story we have created about it. And that story is often shaped more by our own internal world than by external reality. This tendency arises because the surface mind is conditioned by past experiences. It draws from memory, fear, expectation, and habit, projecting these elements onto the present moment. Instead of seeing clearly, we see through layers of interpretation. This is why two people can witness the same event and walk away with completely different understandings. Each person filters reality through their own mental framework, and the result is not truth but perception. The danger of surface thinking lies in its speed and confidence. Because these judgments form so quickly, they often feel correct. There is no pause, no questioning, only immediate belief. And once a conclusion is formed, the mind tends to defend it, ignoring evidence that might challenge it. This creates a cycle of misunderstanding, where assumptions reinforce themselves over time. We begin to relate not to people as they truly are, but to the versions of them we have constructed in our minds. Zen practice encourages us to go beyond this surface level of thinking. Instead of reacting immediately, it invites us to observe, to notice our thoughts without attaching to them. When we slow down and question our first impressions, we begin to see how much of our understanding is based on incomplete information. We realize that what we thought was truth is often just interpretation. Understanding this illusion does not mean we stop forming opinions altogether, but it does mean we hold them more lightly. It means recognizing that there is always more beneath the surface, more context, more meaning than we can see at first glance. When we approach others with this awareness, we become less reactive and more curious. And in that space of curiosity, genuine understanding becomes possible. Reality, as we experience it, is often less objective than we imagine. Much of what we perceive is shaped not by what is actually happening, but by what we project onto it. This idea is vividly illustrated in the story of the two monks and the silent debate. A traveling monk arrived at a remote temple and was invited to engage in a traditional exchange of understanding. Instead of words, the dialogue unfolded through simple hand gestures. The visitor raised one finger, then the resident monk responded with two, followed by three, and finally a clenched fist. To the traveling monk, this exchange represented a profound philosophical discussion about the Buddha, his teachings, and the unity of all things. Impressed by what he believed to be deep wisdom, he admitted defeat and departed with admiration. Yet the reality from the perspective of the younger monk was entirely different. He had interpreted the gestures not as philosophical symbols but as personal insults. When the visitor raised one finger, he believed it was mocking his single eye. His response with two fingers was meant to acknowledge the other man's two eyes. When the visitor raised three fingers, the younger monk thought he was being ridiculed again, this time for the total number of eyes between them. The clenched fist was not a symbol of enlightenment, but a reaction of anger. The same interaction, the same gestures produced two completely different realities. This story reveals the powerful mechanism of projection, the tendency of the mind to assign meaning based on its own internal state. The traveling monk, trained in philosophy and expecting a meaningful debate, projected depth and wisdom onto every gesture. His mind was prepared to see enlightenment, and so that is what he found. The younger monk, shaped by his insecurity about his physical condition, projected insult and mockery onto the same gestures. His mind was prepared to defend itself, and so it perceived threat. In both cases, neither monk was consciously lying or distorting reality. Each was simply interpreting events through the lens of personal belief. This highlights a crucial truth. We do not experience the world directly, we experience our interpretation of it. Our beliefs, expectations, fears, and past experiences act as filters, shaping what we notice and how we understand it. In this sense, reality becomes something we partially create. The implications of this are profound. It means that many of our conflicts, misunderstandings, and emotional reactions are not caused by external events alone, but by the meaning we assign to them. A simple action can be seen as kindness or disrespect, wisdom or insult, depending on the observer's internal framework. Without awareness, we become trapped in our own projections, believing them to be objective truth. Zen teachings encourage us to question this automatic process. Instead of immediately interpreting events, we are invited to observe them more directly, to notice how meaning arises in the mind. When we begin to see our projections clearly, we create space between perception and reaction. In that space, understanding becomes possible. We realize that what we thought was reality may only be one version of it shaped by our own mind. And with that realization comes the freedom to see more clearly and to relate to others with greater openness and humility. The insights from these Zen stories are not limited to monasteries or philosophical discussions. They apply directly to the realities of modern life. Every day in our workplaces, families, and relationships, we encounter situations that test our ability to see clearly. Yet, more often than not, we do not respond to reality itself, but to our interpretation of it. As the saying goes, we don't see reality, we see our interpretation. This simple truth explains why misunderstandings are so common, even among people who care about each other. In the workplace, for example, a manager may give brief feedback without much explanation. One employee might interpret this as efficiency and professionalism, while another may feel criticized or undervalued. The same words, the same tone, but two entirely different experiences. In family life, a similar dynamic unfolds. A parent may speak firmly out of concern, but a child may perceive it as control or lack of trust. A partner who becomes quiet after a long day might be seen as distant or uncaring, when in reality, they are simply exhausted or overwhelmed. These situations are not uncommon. They are part of everyday human interaction. What drives these misunderstandings is not the external event itself, but the internal lens through which we view it. Our past experiences, emotional states, and expectations shape how we interpret what happens around us. If we have been hurt before, we may become more sensitive to signs of rejection. If we value recognition, we may quickly notice when it seems absent. These patterns operate quietly, often without our awareness, yet they strongly influence how we perceive others. The problem is that once an interpretation is formed, it tends to feel like truth. We rarely pause to question it. Instead, we react sometimes defensively, sometimes emotionally, based on assumptions that may not be accurate. This can create cycles of misunderstanding, where both sides feel misunderstood and neither fully sees the other. Over time, these small misinterpretations can grow into larger conflicts, simply because they were never examined. Recognizing the power of perspective allows us to interrupt this cycle. When we begin to understand that our perception is not the same as reality, we create space for curiosity. Instead of immediately reacting, we can ask, is there another way to see this? Or what might I be missing? This shift does not require us to abandon our feelings, but it invites us to hold them more lightly, with awareness that they are shaped by interpretation. In practical terms, this means learning to pause before concluding, to communicate openly rather than assume, and to listen with the intention to understand rather than to confirm our beliefs. It means acknowledging that others are also interpreting the same situation through their own lens, shaped by experiences we may never fully know. When we live with this awareness, our interactions become more flexible and less reactive. We become less certain of our judgments, but more open to truth. And in that openness, we create the possibility for genuine connection, one that is not based on assumptions but on understanding. Among all the forces that shape human behavior, few are as powerful and transformative as genuine compassion. This truth is vividly expressed in the story of Master Sengai and his student, a story that reveals how love can accomplish what punishment never could. In a quiet mountain temple, governed by discipline and routine, one young monk struggled to conform. Though he appeared devoted during the day, he secretly escaped at night, climbing over the temple wall to indulge in the distractions of the outside world. His actions were driven not by rebellion alone, but by an inner conflict, a tension between aspiration and human weakness. Master Sengai, a teacher of deep awareness, soon discovered the pattern. One night, instead of confronting the student directly or setting a trap to expose him, Sengai chose a path that defied expectation. He removed the wooden stool the student used to climb over the wall and quietly took its place standing in the darkness. Hours later, when the student returned, unaware of what had changed, he stepped down, landing not on wood, but on his master's body. In that moment, everything could have turned toward punishment. The student had been caught in deception, had broken the rules, and had quite literally stepped on his teacher. Yet Sengai did not react with anger or disappointment. Instead, he spoke gently. "It is very cold tonight. Be careful not to catch a chill." With these simple words, he walked away, leaving the student alone with a realization far more powerful than any reprimand. What Sengai offered was not correction, but compassion, pure, unconditional, and without judgment. This response struck at the root of the student's behavior. The young monk's secret escapes were not merely acts of disobedience, they were expressions of inner struggle, perhaps even a quiet shame about his inability to live up to the ideal. Had Sengai punished him, that shame might have deepened, pushing the behavior further into secrecy. But instead, Sengai's compassion dissolved it. When a person is met with understanding rather than condemnation, something shifts internally. Defensiveness falls away. The need to hide diminishes. In its place, a deeper awareness arises, one that allows genuine transformation to occur. The student, moved by the unexpected kindness of his teacher, abandoned his nightly escapes completely, not because he was forced to, but because he no longer needed to. This story reveals a profound truth. People do not change simply because they are corrected. They change when they feel seen and accepted. Compassion has the ability to reach places within us that fear and punishment cannot. It does not suppress behavior from the outside, but transforms it from within. In everyday life, we often believe that mistakes must be met with consequences in order to prevent them from happening again. While boundaries are important, this story invites us to consider another approach, one rooted in understanding. When we respond to others with patience, empathy, and care, we create an environment where growth becomes possible. Instead of reinforcing guilt, we offer a path beyond it. Sengai's act of becoming the stool was more than symbolic. It was a demonstration of true leadership and love. He chose to support rather than condemn, to uplift rather than judge. And in doing so, he revealed that the deepest transformations are not achieved through force, but through compassion that sees beyond the mistake and speaks directly to the heart. Human behavior is often shaped by two opposing forces: external discipline and inner transformation. While discipline relies on rules, consequences, and control, true transformation arises from within, a shift in understanding, awareness, and intention. Many systems, both traditional and modern, are built on the belief that punishment is necessary to correct wrongdoing. If someone makes a mistake, they must face consequences severe enough to prevent repetition. At first glance, this approach appears logical. Fear can suppress behavior. It can create temporary compliance. But beneath the surface, it rarely produces lasting change. The reason lies in the psychology of shame. When a person is punished harshly or judged for their actions, they often internalize not just the mistake, but a negative image of themselves. Instead of thinking "I did something wrong," they begin to feel "I am wrong." This distinction is crucial. Shame does not encourage growth. It creates defensiveness, avoidance, and secrecy. A person who feels ashamed is more likely to hide their behavior rather than confront it honestly. The outward behavior may stop for a time, but the inner conflict remains unresolved. In contrast, acceptance creates a completely different internal response. When a person feels seen and understood even in their imperfection, they are more willing to reflect on their actions without fear. Acceptance does not mean approving of harmful behavior, but it means recognizing the humanity behind it. It creates a safe space where self-awareness can emerge. In that space, a person can begin to understand why they acted the way they did, and from that understanding, genuine change becomes possible. This is why transformation that comes from within is far more sustainable than change imposed from the outside. External discipline may shape behavior temporarily, but it cannot reach the deeper causes: fear, insecurity, unmet needs, or confusion that drive that behavior. Inner transformation, on the other hand, addresses these roots directly. It allows a person to change not because they are forced to, but because they see clearly. When change is internally motivated, it carries a different quality. It is not dependent on supervision, pressure, or fear of consequences. It becomes part of who a person is, rather than something they are trying to maintain. This kind of transformation is quieter but more powerful. It does not announce itself, but it endures. In everyday life, this distinction plays out in subtle ways. A child who is constantly punished may learn to avoid being caught, but not necessarily to understand their actions. An employee who fears criticism may comply outwardly while disengaging inwardly. A partner who feels judged may withdraw rather than communicate honestly. In each case, external pressure shapes behavior, but not the underlying reality. Understanding this dynamic invites us to reconsider how we respond to mistakes, both in others and in ourselves. Instead of immediately resorting to correction or control, we can ask, what is driving this behavior? What needs to be understood rather than suppressed? By shifting from judgment to awareness, from punishment to understanding, we create the conditions for real change. Ultimately, lasting transformation is not something that can be imposed. It is something that unfolds when a person is ready to see clearly, and that clarity arises not in the presence of fear, but in the presence of acceptance. One of the deepest lessons in Zen is the understanding that identity, as we often hold on to it, is not something fixed or essential, but something we create and cling to. Titles, roles, talents, and reputations gradually become part of how we define ourselves. We begin to say, I am an artist, I am a teacher, or I am this kind of person, and over time, these identities solidify into something we feel we must protect. Yet, this attachment can quietly limit our freedom. It binds us to expectations, both our own and those of others, and can distract us from a deeper sense of purpose. The story of Geshen offers a powerful example of what it means to let go of this attachment. For many years, Geshen was known as a remarkable painter. His artistic ability brought him recognition, income, and influence. People sought him out not only for his skill, but also for the reputation that surrounded his work. From the outside, it might have seemed natural for him to continue painting for the rest of his life, to refine his craft, expand his fame, and secure his place as a master artist. But Geshen never saw his art as an identity to preserve. For him, it was simply a tool, a means to an end. Once he had achieved his 3 goals, feeding the hungry, building a safe road, and fulfilling his teacher's dream of constructing a temple, Geshen made a decision that surprised many. He put down his brush and never painted again. There was no announcement, no attempt to preserve his legacy, no desire to be remembered. He simply walked away. This act was not a rejection of art, but a demonstration of freedom. He was not attached to being the artist. He was committed only to his purpose, and once that purpose was fulfilled, there was no need to continue. This moment reveals a profound distinction between living for identity and living for purpose. When we are attached to identity, our actions are often driven by the need to maintain a certain image. We continue doing things not because they are necessary, but because they reinforce who we believe we are. Letting go of that identity can feel threatening, as if we are losing a part of ourselves. But in truth, what we lose is only the illusion of a fixed self. Geshen's choice shows that true freedom lies in not being bound by any single role. When identity is no longer something we cling to, we become more flexible, more responsive to what is needed in each moment. We are no longer acting to defend or reinforce the ego, but to serve something greater. Purpose replaces self-image as the guiding force. In modern life, this lesson is especially relevant. Many people define themselves through their careers, achievements, or social roles, often feeling trapped by the need to maintain them. Yet when circumstances change, or when those identities no longer serve a meaningful purpose, letting go can open the door to something deeper. It allows us to ask, not who am I supposed to be, but what is needed now. Letting go of ego and identity does not mean losing direction. It means shifting from a rigid sense of self to a more fluid and responsive way of living. It means recognizing that we are not limited to any single definition, and that our value is not tied to how we are perceived. Like Geshen, we can learn to use our abilities as tools, not as labels. And when the time comes, we can set them down without fear, moving forward with clarity, humility, and freedom. Few experiences confront the human mind as directly as the awareness of death. It is in the face of mortality that our deepest fears, attachments, and uncertainties emerge. Yet within Zen teachings, death is not seen as an end to be feared, but as an opportunity to recognize something far more fundamental, the true nature of mind. This insight is beautifully expressed in the letter written by Master Basui to his dying disciple, a message intended not to comfort in a conventional sense but to awaken a deeper understanding. As the disciple lay weakened by illness, struggling not only with physical pain, but with the fear of losing everything he believed himself to be, Basui pointed him toward a simple yet profound inquiry. What is the essence of this mind, rather than offering reassurance about the future or promising relief from suffering? Basui directed attention inward beyond the changing conditions of the body. He reminded his student that the essence of mind is not something that is born and therefore cannot die. It is not a physical entity that deteriorates, nor an empty void that disappears into nothingness. It is awareness itself, formless, ungraspable, yet always present. This teaching challenges one of our most deeply held assumptions, that we are defined by our body, our memories, and our personal identity. When we believe this, death appears as total annihilation, the complete loss of everything we are. Naturally, fear arises from this belief. But Basui's message invites a shift in perspective. If what we truly are is not limited to these temporary forms, then death is not an ending but a return. Like a snowflake dissolving into the air, we do not cease to exist. We simply merge back into the boundless reality from which we came. The power of this insight lies in its ability to dissolve fear at its root. Fear of death is not just fear of physical pain or the unknown. It is the fear of losing the self we have constructed. But when we begin to question that self, to see that it is constantly changing and never fixed, the fear begins to loosen. What we thought was solid reveals itself to be fluid. What we thought was permanent reveals itself to be temporary. And beyond all of this, there remains a quiet awareness that is unchanged by birth or death. Basui's instruction to his student was not to cling, not to resist, but to observe, to turn attention toward the very mind that was experiencing fear. In doing so, the disciple found a sense of peace that no external reassurance could provide. His struggle softened not because his condition improved, but because his understanding deepened. He no longer saw death as something happening to him, but as part of a larger unfolding in which he was already included. In our own lives, we often avoid thinking about death, treating it as something distant or uncomfortable. Yet this avoidance keeps the fear intact. Zen offers a different approach: to face it directly, to inquire into what it truly means, and in doing so to discover a freedom that is not dependent on circumstances. When we recognize the nature of mind as something beyond birth and death, we are no longer confined by the limits of the body or the story of the self. This does not remove the reality of loss or the natural sadness that comes with it, but it transforms our relationship to it. Death is no longer an absolute ending, but a transition, a return to what has always been present. And in that recognition, fear gives way to clarity, resistance gives way to acceptance, and life itself becomes something we can experience more fully, without the shadow of constant anxiety about its end.